The storm rolled through Oak Ridge County like it had something personal against the town. Trees bent low under screaming wind, power lines snapped in the distance, and the rain hit so hard against Caleb Mercer's truck windshield that he had to pull over twice just to see the road ahead. By sunrise, half the county looked bruised. Fences were broken, mailboxes twisted sideways, and branches covered the streets like scattered bones after a fight. Caleb had barely slept when his phone buzzed at 8 in the morning. He expected another roofing request or emergency repair call. Storm season always meant overtime for a handyman like him. But the moment he saw the name on the screen, his stomach tightened in a way exhaustion could not explain. Diane Holloway. His ex-girlfriend's mother. For a second, he just stared at the phone while memories he had spent almost a year trying to bury pushed themselves back to the surface. The family cookouts. Sunday lunches. Diane's soft laugh from the kitchen. The way her daughter Vanessa used to roll her eyes whenever Caleb fixed something around the house instead of hiring help. Vanessa always called him too simple. Too steady. Too predictable. In the end, predictable was exactly why she left. Caleb finally answered the phone with a tired voice, unsure whether he wanted the conversation to happen at all. Diane sounded calm, almost hesitant. Her backyard fence had collapsed during the storm, and she said she did not know who else to call. Then her voice softened in a way that caught him off guard. She told him she trusted his work more than anyone else's. And before hanging up, she quietly added, "Finish it, and I'll make it worth your while." Before the story continues, take a second to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Lifeline Vibes if you still believe kindness, loyalty, and second chances matter in this world. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the people who value us most are the ones who notice our quiet strength when everyone else overlooks it. By noon, the sky had cleared into a pale blue afternoon, the kind that feels washed clean after chaos. Caleb parked outside Diane's small white farmhouse at the edge of town. The place looked different than he remembered. Smaller somehow. Quieter. Vanessa had moved to Chicago months ago after breaking things off with him, chasing a faster life with a man who drove imported cars and wore expensive watches. Diane stayed behind alone. The broken fence leaned awkwardly into the mud behind the house. Several wooden posts had split completely in half. Caleb unloaded his tools without saying much. Diane greeted him at the back porch wearing faded jeans, gardening gloves, and an expression that looked older than it had a year ago. She thanked him twice before he even touched the fence. That bothered him more than it should have. People usually only thanked him after the work was done. Diane thanked him simply for showing up. Caleb spent the next hour digging damaged posts from the soaked ground while the sun warmed the wet grass around him. Sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the cool breeze. He focused on measurements and wood alignment, trying not to think about how strange this all felt. But every now and then, he noticed Diane watching from the porch swing with a quiet expression he could not read. Not flirtation. Not pity. Something gentler. Something far more dangerous. Recognition. Around lunchtime, Diane called him inside to eat. Caleb almost refused out of habit. He had spent years being the kind of man who did not want to inconvenience anybody. But she insisted softly, and eventually he stepped into the kitchen he used to know so well. The smell hit him first. Fresh bread. Roasted chicken. Lemon tea. Home. Not the loud version of home filled with arguments and expectations. A peaceful version. One he had forgotten existed. Diane set a plate in front of him without fuss. No dramatic compliments. No awkward questions. Just simple care. For several minutes they ate in silence while sunlight spilled across the wooden table. Caleb realized something strange then. He could not remember the last time someone made him lunch simply because they wanted him to rest. Vanessa used to complain that Caleb worked too much but also mocked the kind of work he did. She hated dirt under his nails. Hated his old truck. Hated that he preferred fixing things instead of replacing them. Toward the end of their relationship, every conversation felt like an audition he was failing. Diane finally broke the silence carefully. She admitted that she never agreed with how Vanessa treated him. The words landed harder than Caleb expected. Because deep down, he had spent months wondering whether Vanessa had been right about him after all. Maybe he really was boring. Maybe stability was unattractive. Maybe being dependable was just another word for forgettable. Diane looked at him for a long moment before quietly saying something he would remember for years. Peace feels boring to people addicted to chaos. The room went still after that. Caleb lowered his eyes toward his untouched tea because suddenly emotion tightened his throat in a way that embarrassed him. Nobody had defended him before. Not like that. The afternoon passed slowly beneath warm daylight and drifting clouds. Caleb repaired the fence section by section while Diane worked in her garden nearby. Occasionally they spoke about ordinary things. Tomatoes. Weather. Rising grocery prices. It should have felt meaningless. Instead, it felt safe. That frightened Caleb more than anything. Because after Vanessa left, he promised himself he would never confuse comfort with love again. He buried himself in work. 12-hour days. Empty dinners. Quiet nights. He convinced himself that wanting emotional closeness only made people vulnerable. Yet standing in Diane's backyard, listening to birds return after the storm, he realized loneliness had become so normal that simple kindness now felt overwhelming. Late in the afternoon, a black SUV rolled into the driveway unexpectedly. Caleb immediately recognized Vanessa stepping out before the engine even stopped. His chest tightened. She looked exactly the same. Stylish sunglasses. Expensive clothes. Perfect hair untouched by the humidity. The kind of beauty that turned heads instantly but somehow never made a room feel warmer. Vanessa froze when she saw Caleb near the fence. Then her expression hardened. The tension arrived instantly like another storm cloud rolling over the property. She questioned why he was there, though the broken fence stood right in front of her. Diane calmly explained that she called him for help. Vanessa laughed sharply under her breath, muttering that her mother could afford professional contractors. Caleb felt humiliation creep up his neck. Same as always. But Diane surprised both of them. She told Vanessa that Caleb was more professional than most contractors she had ever met. Silence followed. Vanessa looked genuinely stunned. For years, Caleb had watched Diane avoid conflict with her daughter at all costs. Yet now, standing in broad daylight beside the damaged garden, Diane defended him openly without hesitation. Vanessa's irritation slowly transformed into something uglier. Regret. People imagine regret arrives dramatically. It usually does not. Sometimes it appears in tiny cracks around someone's eyes when they realize the person they dismissed found value somewhere else. Vanessa suddenly became overly friendly. Asking questions. Mentioning old memories. Suggesting they all have dinner together sometime soon. But Caleb noticed something important. Diane never once stepped aside emotionally. She stayed calm. Present. Quietly protective. Not possessive. Protective. And somehow that mattered more. After Vanessa finally left, the yard felt heavy with unspoken emotions. Caleb returned to work, pretending his hands were not trembling slightly while tightening the final fence panels into place. By sunset, the fence stood tall again. Straight. Strong. Reliable. A lot like him. Diane walked slowly across the grass to inspect the finished work. Golden evening light softened the lines on her face while the wind moved gently through the trees above them. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile customers gave after paying invoices. A real one. The kind that reaches tired eyes. She handed him an envelope for payment, but Caleb hesitated before taking it. Something about the moment felt too personal for money alone. Diane seemed to sense that immediately. Then came the sentence that changed everything. She told him the fence was never the only thing broken after the storm. Caleb looked at her carefully. For the first time all day, Diane allowed her own loneliness to show. She admitted the house had felt unbearably quiet since Vanessa moved away. She confessed that most people only visited when they needed something. But Caleb had always been different. He noticed when groceries needed carrying. He fixed cabinet doors without being asked. He listened when others interrupted. He made places feel calmer, she said softly. Nobody had ever described him that way before. Caleb felt emotion rise painfully inside his chest because he realized how starving he had become for simple appreciation. Not praise. Not admiration. Just acknowledgement. To be seen clearly without being treated like he was lacking. The sun dipped lower, washing the backyard in warm orange light. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes stirred softly. Diane stepped closer, though still carefully respectful. Then she thanked him again. Not for the fence. For the peace he brought with him. And in that moment, Caleb understood something that changed him forever. The right people do not love you despite your quietness. They love you because your presence feels safe enough for them to finally rest. Months later, Caleb still visited the farmhouse occasionally. Sometimes for repairs. Sometimes for lunch. Sometimes for no reason at all except that life felt less heavy there. Nothing reckless happened between them. That was what made it beautiful. There was dignity in their restraint. Patience in the way they protected each other from gossip, assumptions, and loneliness disguised as impulse. They built trust carefully, like repairing storm damage one board at a time. And slowly, Caleb stopped apologizing for being the kind of man he was. Steady. Gentle. Dependable. The same qualities one person called boring became the exact qualities another person treasured. And maybe that is the quiet tragedy of life. Some people only recognize peace after they lose it. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Lifeline Vibes. Stories like this remind us that the deepest connections are not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes they arrive softly, through ordinary moments that make us feel understood for the very first time. Special request before the ending. Comment below where you are watching from, and tell us, do you believe peace is more valuable than excitement in a relationship? One warm spring afternoon nearly a year later, Caleb stood once again beside Diane's backyard fence while sunlight spilled across the grass. The wood had weathered beautifully. Strong. Unshaken. Diane stepped onto the porch carrying 2 glasses of lemonade while laughter drifted softly between them. And for the first time in a very long time, Caleb no longer felt like a man somebody had failed to choose. He felt chosen. Not because he changed who he was, but because someone mature enough finally understood his value before it was too late. Sometimes love does not arrive like lightning. Sometimes it arrives quietly after the storm ends, sits beside you in the sunlight, and gently reminds you that being safe to love is rare too.